So today's subject is one I've always found fascinating, and that subject is the idea of speaking out on something, standing up for your values, social activism. Maybe you're fighting for social justice, right? You're speaking out. And, I sometimes I have a negative view of the people that tend to do this sort of activity. I've spoken negatively many times on video in the past about things like social activism. It's because, not that I have anything necessarily against activism itself as far as an activity, it's just most of the people that engage in this sort of activity go about it completely the wrong way. I think they do more harm for their cause than the good they do. And in most cases, I think they're actually harming themselves individually by participating in this activity. Probably my biggest complaint against things like social activism is that you cannot make somebody else change, right? That is not possible. The only person that you can actually change is yourself. You can't actually change the hearts and minds of other people. That is an impossible task. That never works. That will never work. Think about it. If I came to you and said that you have to change your ways, I'm telling you exactly what you must do because I said so, would you ever do it? And it doesn't matter what I tell you. It could be anything in the world, but if I tell you you have to do it because I say so, would you actually do that thing? No, of course not. You would tell me to go F myself, right? And that's what all of these people are telling you. If you're a social activist, you cannot force people to change. People will change their hearts and minds when they're ready to change. You can't force the change. The other big problem with things like social activism is the fact that if you're spending all of your time worrying about what everybody else is doing with their lives and trying to change the rest of the world, you're not actually working on the most important person that you should be working on, which is yourself. If you want to change the world, you really have to start with yourself. And most social activists, they don't work on themselves at all. Typically, they're very mean-spirited, nasty, angry people in life, and it's because they never really properly bettered themselves in life. They were worried about fixing everyone else. They forgot to actually fix themselves. Some of the nastiest and vilest and just meanest people you will ever meet in life are social activists. And the reason is because they're trying to do an impossible task. We've already said you can't change the hearts and minds of others. You can't go out and change the world. All you can do is change yourself. But these people are trying to change the world. That's impossible, and it makes them bitter and angry because they never get anywhere. And when I say they never get anywhere, it's not that they don't achieve their ultimate goal. It's they don't see any progress at all, because even a single person, they've never affected change in even a single person, because they're trying to do an impossible task. And again, that just is going to leave you an angry and bitter person in the end. But you know who's not angry? Who's not bitter? It's those people that are primarily focused on themselves, that are trying to better themselves, make themselves a better person. Those are typically the people that have their shit together. They're typically very happy people. They're not angry. They don't take things personally in life. They're, just happy-go-lucky kinds of people, and they're pleasant to be around. And, a lot of times the people you surround yourself with, their attitudes are infectious to others. So these social activists, they don't realize that because they're so angry and bitter, it actually makes everybody around them angry and bitter. They're changing the world in some cases. They're changing it for the worse, though, where if they focus on themselves and make themselves a happier person, then this happy person out in the world would actually infect others with happiness, and they would actually see real positive change. That's why the change has to start with you. Work on yourself first. But probably the biggest complaint I have about speaking out, especially on societal issues, anybody that's doing social activism, social justice kinds of activities these days, here in the last 10 years, one of my biggest complaints, as far as an observation I've made, is that people tend to only speak out on issues now because it's popular and because it's convenient to do so. I find it absolutely disgusting how many people are all over the internet talking about racism, speaking out about racism, say here in the U.S., when racism actually was a real thing. Decades ago, there was serious racial problems, especially in the part of the U.S. that I live in. I'm in the deep southern part of the U.S. And, a lot of those problems have gone away. A lot of especially the violence and stuff, that's decades past. That doesn't exist now. But now all of a sudden, where these racial tensions are not a real thing, right? Now people want to speak out on that. And that's weird, right? That's weak. That's cowardly to speak out on something when it's a perfectly safe thing to do. Where were these people if they're old enough? If you lived in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, when there was serious racial tension in the U.S., were these same people, if they were old enough to have lived back then, were they speaking out back then? Or are they just speaking out now because it's cool to do so on platforms like Twitter and Facebook? The same thing can be said with homophobia. People love to speak out against homophobia now when, being gay is just considered normal. There's not the kind of tensions. Like when I was a kid, most of you guys know I'm a classically trained musician. I've got college degrees in music. I played, symphonies and operas and ballets. And, anytime you deal with the fine arts, from my earliest years until an adult, a lot of the men, especially in fine arts related fields, are gay, and that's fine. I grew up, I had gay friends when I was in high school and college, and we're talking about going back 30, 40 years ago, right? And, homophobia was an issue back then, but nobody really spoke up about it, right? Being gay was not socially accepted 40 years ago, where now nobody cares, but now all of a sudden people want to speak up on these kinds of issues like homophobia and, again, racism. People only speak up when it's popular, when it's convenient, and that's weak sauce. And I laugh when I see all these people that pretend like they're being brave for speaking out about things that a bajillion other people are also speaking out about because it's the cool thing, it's the popular thing to do now. You're not brave, right? That's a perfectly safe thing to do. It's only brave when you speak out on something and you could actually face some real backlash, potentially violence in some cases. That's being brave to speak out on something. I'll give you a good example with me. Now, I won't say I've faced any kind of violence or anything, but here is an example of me speaking out on something, standing up for my values when it wasn't cool to do. You guys know I am a free software zealot, right? And I was speaking out about free software and open source software going back 25 years ago. Even when I was on Windows, I was using a lot of free and open source software, and I really bought into the whole ideology, switched to Linux, about 20 years ago or whatever. Obviously, you guys know my YouTube channel. I've been doing this YouTube channel for about 7 or 8 years now. About 8 years now. And obviously I promoted free software very heavily when I started the channel because I didn't see a lot of YouTube content creators, especially in the Linux space, really preaching the message of free and open source software. And I didn't realize it at the time, but most people did not want to hear that message, including a lot of people in the Linux community. They did not like the message of free software or open source software. They wanted to pretend like Linux was just like Windows, just like proprietary software. And they saw me as, in some cases, being dangerous, as being an extremist. Other content creators were labeling me that way. I was having people threatening me in my comment section because I talked too much about free software, and, I was just this radical extremist, and I was infecting people's minds, and yada, yada, yada. And now, 7, 8 years later, I get none of that, right? Because the world has changed. We have moved on since then. Now the Linux community is all about free and open source software. That is the normal message. Speaking out about free software, open source software now is a great thing to do, but it's also a very safe, very popular thing to do now, right? It wasn't the safe and popular thing to do, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, right? People looked at you very strangely. But here's the other thing I was doing when I was speaking out about free and open source software. I wasn't necessarily trying to make people choose free and open source software. I was just trying to let people know that free and open source software existed. I wasn't trying to change hearts and minds. I don't care what people run as far as their software. If people want to run all proprietary software, I don't care. It doesn't affect me. Again, I'm worried about mainly working on myself. I do want to share that I enjoy free and open source software, that I prefer it, but I'm not trying to do the impossible. I'm not trying to change the world. And that's something you really have to, if you're one of these people that are out there trying to change everybody but yourself, all you're doing is just bashing your head into a brick wall every day. And at some point, it's just going to drive you insane. And it may actually lead to an early grave, because you're just going to be an angry and bitter and really just disappointed person in life. And I don't want that. So instead of focusing on everybody else, please focus on yourself. Peace, guys.